So today I'll be continuing with my college football game by game prediction and roster discussion videos. Today I'll be doing the Clemson Tigers. So Clemson's recruiting has fallen way off this year. In 2024, Dabo Swinney had the 14th ranked recruiting class in the country, and in 2025 he only had the 23rd ranked recruiting class. But starting on the offensive side of the ball, they were good here last year, averaging 36.4 points per game, which ranked at 13th in the country. And I think they'll have similar to that this year. So at quarterback, they're in great shape here with Cade Klubnik coming back. I talked about him in my top 10 Heisman Trophy candidates video. Clemson last year was the best they had been at quarterback since Trevor Lawrence was playing for them. And at wide receiver, they're very good here too. From 2021 to 2023, Clemson was missing a great wide receiver that they had always had at least a couple of from 2015 to 2020 when they made the college football playoff every year. And last year, they seem to have found a great wide receiver in Antonio Williams, who is coming back. Last season, he had 75 catches for 904 and 11 touchdowns, averaging 12.1 a catch. And they have TJ Moore, a five-star wide receiver who had a good freshman season last year with 45 catches for 651 and five touchdowns, averaging 14.5 a catch. He had a huge game in the playoff game against Texas with nine catches for 116 and a touchdown. And they have Bryant Wesco, who is also a five-star who had a good freshman season. He played in 12 games and had 41 catches for 708 and five touchdowns, averaging a very impressive 17.3 yards per catch. He had a huge game in the ACC championship against SMU with eight catches for 143 and two touchdowns. And they have Tyler Brown, who barely played last year because of an injury, but in 2023, as a freshman, he was Clemson's best wide receiver with 52 catches for 531 and four touchdowns. And they bring in a transfer wide receiver from an FCS team coming from Southeast Missouri State, Tristan Smith. He was a good player at that level. He played in 11 games last year and had 76 catches for 934 and six touchdowns, averaging 12.3 a catch. And at running back, that's concerning for Clemson because they lose at Phil Maffa, who's off to the NFL, and he was by far their best running back last season. They'll be depending on two true freshman running backs, and while running backs, I think are good more as a freshman than any other position. You just don't know how good they're going to be until you see them play. But Clemson's offensive line it should be top 10 in the country. They have Matt Luke returning, who is I think one of the best offensive line coaches in the country. And he was the head coach at Ole Miss for 3 years. And as an Ole Miss fan, I'll tell you, he was a horrible head coach, and I was so glad to see him go. But I would love to have him back at Ole Miss as the offensive line coach. And Clemson has four starters back on their offensive line. They've got tackles Tristan Lay and Blake Miller coming back, and center Ryan Linthicum, and starting guard Walker Parks. Uh, they do lose one starting guard though, but their new other starting guard does have starting experience. And on the defensive side, the defensive coordinator they brought in from Penn State, Tom Allen, I think is one of the best defensive coordinators in the country. And Clemson defensively last year gave up on average 23.4 points per game. And while that's not bad at all, that's a very solid defense. It was bad for what Clemson is used to defensively. And I think that's going to be better this year by quite a bit because their new defensive coordinator is going to have a lot of talent to work with. So on the defensive line, they're going to be really good. They returned two great defensive linemen, T.J. Parker and Peter Woods. T.J. Parker is one of the best defensive players in the country. Last year, he had 57 tackles and 11 sacks and 49 total quarterback pressures and six forced fumbles and two fumble recoveries and a pass breakup. And Peter Woods played in 11 games last year. He was dealing with an injury, but he still had 28 tackles and three sacks and 20 total quarterback pressures and a forced fumble. But TJ Parker is their best defensive player and by far their best pass rusher. And they bring in a very good defensive lineman from Purdue, Will Helt, who had last year 56 tackles and five sacks and 26 total quarterback pressures. And then at linebacker, they do lose their best one, Barrett Carter, who there's really no replacement for, who's off to the NFL. But they do return the other two starting linebackers from last season, who are both good. Wade Woodess, who played in 12 games last year and had 83 tackles and three sacks and five pass breakups and three forced fumbles and an interception and 22 total quarterback pressures. And Sammy Brown, who had last year 80 tackles and five sacks and 31 total quarterback pressures and three pass breakups last season. And then in the secondary, they returned both starting corners. Avian Terrell is their best corner. He had last year 58 tackles and 12 pass breakups and two interceptions and three forced fumbles and a sack. And they've got Jaden Lucas coming back, who had last year 34 tackles and seven pass breakups and an interception. And then at safety, they do lose R.J. Mickens, who was their best safety, who's off to the NFL. But they do return the other starting safety from last season, Khalil Barnes, who had last year 61 tackles and four interceptions and three pass breakups and three quarterback pressures. So now for the game by game predictions, starting with LSU. So this is going to be a very close game, I think, and I think it's going to be pretty high scoring. But what came down to it, my pick for me was home field advantage for Clemson. And Clemson's coaching staff, I think, being better than LSU's. So that's why I'm going with Clemson to win this game. And now Troy, this will be like a name your score kind of game for Clemson. Their second string will be playing probably the whole second half. It'll be a big blowout win for Clemson. And now on the road at Georgia Tech. I have to go with Clemson to win this game because Clemson owns Georgia Tech. I think it's more likely that Georgia Tech beats Georgia than it is that they beat Clemson. And Clemson has a better coaching staff than Georgia Tech, and they've got a better roster by a lot. Now, Georgia Tech is going to have a good secondary. And with Clemson being a passing team, that could really slow down Clemson's offense in this game. But Clemson's biggest strength on their defense is going to be their front seven, and Georgia Tech's a running team. So that's going to hurt Georgia Tech offensively in this game. And Georgia Tech's quarterback, Haynes King, can be dangerous, but he's not going to play in the NFL, I don't think, like I think Cade Klubnik will. And Cade Klubnik, I think, is going to have a little bit better offensive line than Haynes King will at Georgia Tech, although I think Georgia Tech will have a good offensive line too. And Clemson has a better wide receiver room than Georgia Tech will. So I'm going with Clemson to get the win in what could be a pretty close game. And now that Syracuse, this should be a pretty easy win for Clemson. I've looked at Syracuse's roster, and they lose so much from last year. I think they're going to take a big step back. And on the road at North Carolina, Clemson is going to beat up on North Carolina. North Carolina hired this former Super Bowl winning NFL coach who has never coached a college game in his life as a head coach or as an assistant coach, and paid him a ridiculous amount of money for doing nothing yet, and it's going to blow up on them. On the road at Boston College, this will be a pretty easy win, I think, for Clemson. Clemson already was a much better team than Boston College is, and Boston College now loses a defensive lineman that was an amazing player that they have no replacement for. He had last year 80 tackles and like 16 sacks, and Boston College ran off their quarterback. And Clemson has a much better coaching staff than Boston College does. And now SMU. Cade Klubnik is going to have a lot more good options at the wide receiver position to throw to than Kevin Jennings will at SMU. And I like Clemson's defense better than SMU's because SMU loses so much on their defensive line. That was the biggest strength of their defense last season, and especially with the game being at Clemson, I've got to go with Clemson to get this win because SMU, I think, is going to take a pretty big step back this year, but this will probably still be a competitive game. And now Duke. So having looked at Duke's roster last night, their defense, I think, is going to be pretty good. So they may be able to slow down Clemson's offense some in this game, but Duke's offense is not going to be very good. and Clemson's defense is going to make it to where Duke isn't hardly going to be able to score, I think, in this game. And Clemson's got a much better offensive line than Duke does. So Clemson will win this game by, I think, at least a couple of scores. And now Florida State. So this will be a pretty easy win, I think, for Clemson. Florida State may be one of the most improved teams this year, not because they're a good team, but because they went 2-10 last year, and this year they may go at 6-6 or 7-5. But Clemson's got a much better coach than Florida State has got, and a much better quarterback. Florida State brought in the quarterback that Boston College ran off. So you know he's been run off if he's went to play for a dump like Florida State. But Clemson's also got much better lines of scrimmage than Florida State does, and a much better wide receiver room. So on the road at Louisville, I'm going with a loss in this one because Louisville's head coach Jeff Fromm is, I think, one of the best offensive minds in college football, and he gets the most he can out of his rosters. He did it when he was at Purdue, and now he's doing it at Louisville. And Louisville's defense held Clemson to just 21 points last year, and I think Louisville's defense is going to be at least as good this year as it was last year. Now, I think the game will be closer than it was last year, but these Friday night road games have caused so many upsets when the favorite doesn't have a bye week before the game. And now Furman, this will be a easy win for Clemson. They'll be able to win this one by however much they want, and their second string will be playing the whole second half, no doubt. And now on the road at South Carolina. So this would be huge for South Carolina if they could beat Clemson a second year in a row and a third time in the last 4 years. But I don't think it's happening. I'm going with Clemson to get this win. Now, I think this will be a close, low-scoring game like it was last year because South Carolina's strength in their defense is going to be their secondary because they lose so much in their front at seven. So they'll probably slow down Klubnik and his wide receivers. But Clemson's front seven, I think, is much better than South Carolina's is, and Klubnik has got a much better wide receiver room than Lenora Sellers has got it at South Carolina. And South Carolina is a team that I think is a little bit overrated because they returned their quarterback and several other really good players. My prediction for Clemson is 11-1 overall and 7-1 in the conference. This will for sure get them to the ACC championship and but to the college football playoff. So that will be it with this video. Please subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back soon.